I always thought I had a pretty simple life. Hard, sure, but straightforward. I had my little phone repair business in town, something I'd built up with my own two hands. In the evenings, I worked as a taxi driver to make extra cash, which wasn't glamorous, but it kept food on the table for my family. My wife, Melissa, stayed home with our 4 kids. 3 boys and the youngest, our little girl, Lily. She was my sunshine, always running up to hug me the second I walked through the door. Life wasn't easy, but I thought we were happy. That started to change about a year ago. Melissa got into this network marketing thing, selling some kind of supplements. It seemed harmless at first. She'd always been outgoing and good with people, so I figured it was just a hobby to give her something to do. But then the money started rolling in. And I don't mean a little extra here and there. I'm talking more than I was making from both my jobs combined. First, I was proud of her. Who wouldn't be? She'd found something she was good at, and I didn't have to carry the full weight of the finances anymore. But as the months went on, it felt like the Melissa I knew was slipping away. She started dressing differently. Tighter dresses, higher heels, makeup that felt more suited for a nightclub than for running errands. She'd be out at all hours, going to meetings and events. She'd leave the kids with my mom or her sister without a second thought, saying it was just for a few hours, though it often turned into all night. I tried to talk to her about it, but she brushed me off. "I'm doing this for us," she'd say. "I'm building something better for our family." I wanted to believe her, but it was hard when she barely seemed to be a part of the family anymore. Things came to a head one evening when Lily got sick. I'll never forget it. She'd eaten something bad, and she was vomiting nonstop. I told Melissa we needed to take her to the hospital, but she just waved it off, saying, "It's probably just a stomach bug. My mom can handle it." And then she left, walking out the door in a low-cut red dress and heels so high I thought she'd break an ankle. I stayed up all night with Lily, watching her little chest rise and fall as she lay curled up on the couch, burning with fever. The next morning, Melissa strolled in like nothing had happened. I asked her where she'd been, and she snapped at me. "Do you have any idea how much I'm working to make sure we're not stuck in this rut forever? Maybe if you made more money, I wouldn't have to kill myself trying to fix this family." That hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew I wasn't some big-shot businessman, but I thought I was doing enough. Clearly, she didn't see it that way. The cracks in our relationship just kept getting deeper after that. A couple of weeks later, our eldest son, Danny, came home from basketball practice with a swollen, black and blue finger. He said he'd jammed it during a game, but I could tell it was broken. When I showed Melissa, she barely glanced at it. "It's just a bruise," she said, not even looking up from her phone. "You're overreacting." I ended up taking Danny to the clinic myself, where the doctor confirmed it was a fracture. When I confronted Melissa about it later, she blew up. "Why don't you take care of the kids yourself if you're so worried about it? I'm the one bringing in the real money now. You should be grateful." Grateful. That word sat in my stomach like a stone. Was this how she saw me now? Just some failure who couldn't provide for his family? The arguments started happening more often. We'd fight about the kids, about money, about how little time she spent at home. But every time she'd turn it back on me. "You're just jealous that I'm doing better than you," she'd say. "You don't like that I'm not some little housewife waiting for you to come home." The worst part was, I could feel myself starting to believe her. Maybe I was a failure. Maybe I wasn't enough. I tried throwing myself even harder into my work, taking extra taxi shifts at night and trying to drum up more business for the repair shop. But no matter what I did, it felt like I was just treading water while she was sprinting ahead. One night, after another argument, I sat in the living room long after she'd gone to bed. The house was dark and quiet, except for the faint sound of Lily snoring in her room. I thought about how everything used to feel so simple, back when Melissa and I were just 2 kids in love, dreaming about the family we'd have one day. What had happened to us? How had we ended up here? I didn't have an answer then. I wasn't sure I'd ever have one. But deep down, I knew something was coming. I could feel it, like the tension in the air before a storm. And as much as I tried to ignore it, I knew that storm was going to change everything. The changes in Melissa weren't just a phase. they became a new reality. Every week, she seemed to drift further away from the person I married. I kept telling myself it was the stress of her work, that maybe she just needed time to adjust to her newfound success. But the truth? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon. I was cleaning up the kitchen after lunch when I heard a knock on the door. It was unusual because most people just texted or called. When I opened the door, there was a man standing there. Tall, broad shoulders, and wearing an expensive suit. He had the slicked-back hair, a confident grin, and the kind of presence that instantly made you uneasy. He introduced himself as Richard, Melissa's boss. "I was just dropping Melissa off," he said, gesturing to the sleek black car parked at the curb. She was sitting in the passenger seat, looking down at her phone. I invited him in, feeling like I didn't have much of a choice. Melissa got out of the car a minute later and followed him inside, laughing at something he said. She didn't even glance at me. "I just need to grab something for the meeting," she said, brushing past me like I was a stranger. Richard sat himself down at our kitchen table like he owned the place, giving the kids a big, toothy smile. "Nice family you've got," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge that made my skin crawl. I muttered a thank you, but I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze. I busied myself wiping the counters, all the while listening to their voices from the other room. Melissa was giggling at something he said, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in months. She came back a few minutes later, dressed to the nines in a tight blazer and skirt combo that left little to the imagination. "We've got to go," she said, barely glancing my way, and just like that, they were gone. The whole thing left a bitter taste in my mouth. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Richard. He wasn't just her boss. There was something about the way he looked at her, the way she seemed so comfortable around him. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the doubts were creeping in like a slow poison. A week later, I found the condoms. Melissa had left her purse on the kitchen counter, something she rarely did. I wasn't trying to snoop, but when I reached for my car keys, the purse toppled over, spilling its contents onto the counter. That's when I saw them. A small, unopened pack of condoms. My stomach dropped. We hadn't used those in years. When she came home that evening, I confronted her. She laughed it off. "Oh, those? That purse is from last year's vacation. They must have been in there this whole time," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "You're making a big deal out of nothing." "Nothing?" I said, my voice shaking. "Melissa, we're married. Why would you even have those in the first place?" She rolled her eyes. "God, you're so paranoid. I'm not doing anything. Okay? Maybe if you trusted me a little more, we wouldn't be having this conversation." I didn't believe her, but I didn't push it. I should have, but I was afraid of what I might find if I kept digging. Instead, I let it fester inside me, trying to bury it under long hours at work and late-night taxi shifts. Then came the night she didn't come home. She had told me earlier that day she had a big meeting and might be home late. By midnight, I started texting her. By 2 a.m., I was calling her over and over again. No response. I barely slept that night, staring at my phone, hoping for some kind of explanation. She finally walked through the door at 7 a.m., wearing the same clothes from the night before. "Where were you?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. She sighed, looking annoyed. "I told you I had a meeting. It ran late, and I ended up crashing at a coworker's place." "You couldn't call? Text? Something? Are you serious right now?" she snapped. "I work my ass off for this family, and this is the thanks I get? You're treating me like some teenager who broke curfew. Grow up, will you?" I was too stunned to respond. She stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. I stood there in the middle of the living room, my hands clenched into fists, trying to keep my emotions from boiling over. Things were spiraling out of control, and I had no idea how to stop it. After that, I started noticing more little things. She'd get text messages late at night and smile at her phone before hiding it. She started spending more time at work, always with an excuse about some new project or event. And Richard, the man I couldn't get out of my head, seemed to be a constant presence in her life. I tried to focus on the kids, to be the rock they needed in the middle of all this chaos. Danny, my eldest, had started acting out, refusing to talk to his mom and spending more time locked in his room. Lily, my youngest, clung to me every chance she got, sensing the tension in the house. The middle boys were quieter than usual, caught in the crossfire but too young to really understand what was happening. One night, after another blowout argument with Melissa, I found myself sitting in the driveway in my car, staring at the house. I didn't want to go back inside. I didn't want to face the silence, the distance, the constant reminder that the woman I loved was slipping away from me. I lit a cigarette, something I hadn't done in years, and watched the smoke curl into the night sky. For the first time, I allowed myself to think the unthinkable. What if she was cheating on me? What if this whole life I'd worked so hard to build was falling apart, and there was nothing I could do to stop it? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that things couldn't go on like this much longer. Something had to give. I decided to throw myself into work. If I couldn't fix what was going on at home, at least I could make sure the bills were paid. The kids had what they needed, and we didn't drown under the weight of everything falling apart. My repair shop was holding steady, but I knew it wouldn't be enough to carry us forward. I had to hustle harder. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from a guy who managed an electronics store in town. He'd heard about my shop and said he had a proposition for me. He needed someone reliable to handle phone repairs for his customers, and he wanted to partner up. It was a big deal, a steady stream of work that could seriously boost my income. I was over the moon. Felt like maybe things were starting to look up. That night, I sat down with the kids for dinner, something I hadn't done properly in weeks. I made spaghetti, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw them smile. Lily was swinging her feet under the table, chatting about her favorite cartoons, while Danny joked about how bad my cooking was. Even the middle boys, Ethan and Sam, chimed in here and there. It reminded me of what I was fighting for, what I had to protect. But Melissa wasn't there. She'd texted earlier, saying she'd be late again because of some team-building event. I didn't even bother responding. I just stared at my phone, that familiar knot of anger and frustration tightening in my chest. It felt like she was missing everything important, like she didn't even care anymore. Later that evening, after putting the kids to bed, I decided to clean out some old papers in the attic. The electronics store deal required a copy of my diploma, and I thought I'd stashed it somewhere up there years ago. The attic was a mess. Boxes of forgotten memories, baby clothes, and random junk we'd collected over the years. As I dug through the clutter, my hand brushed against something heavy and solid. It was a large cardboard box taped shut. At first, I thought it might be an old box of Christmas decorations or something, but when I opened it, I froze. Inside were neat stacks of cash, wads of $100 bills, wrapped in rubber bands. I stared at it, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. There had to be at least $100,000 in there, maybe more. My mind was racing. Where had this money come from? Why was it hidden up here? And why hadn't Melissa ever mentioned it? I sat there for a long time, just staring at the box. A part of me wanted to believe it was some kind of surprise for the family, a rainy day fund she'd saved up from her network marketing job. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. This wasn't the kind of money you made selling supplements, no matter how successful you were. This was something else entirely. When Melissa finally came home that night, I was waiting for her in the living room. She walked in with her usual air of indifference, tossing her purse on the couch and kicking off her heels. "Hey!" she said, barely looking at me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. She glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. "About what?" "About the box in the attic." Her expression didn't change at first, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Something that confirmed what I already knew. She sat down on the armrest of the couch, crossing her arms. "What box?" "Don't play dumb, Melissa. The one with the money. I found it today." She hesitated for just a second, then shrugged. "It's not a big deal. It's just money I've been saving." "For what?" I pressed. "And where did it come from?" There's no way you made that much selling supplements. Her jaw tightened. Why does it matter? This money for us, for the kids. Why can't you just be happy about it? Because I don't trust you anymore. The words came out louder than I intended, and I instantly regretted it. But it was the truth. I didn't trust her. Not with the kids, not with the house, not with anything. She stood up, her face hard. You know what? I'm done with this conversation. You're acting like a child. I don't have to explain myself to you. She stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. I sat there in the silence, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of what was happening. That box of cash was like a bomb waiting to go off, and I had no idea how to defuse it. The next morning, I decided to take the kids to my mom's house for the day. They needed a break from the tension, and honestly, so did I. I dropped them off and told my mom I'd pick them up after work. I had a meeting at the electronics store to finalize the contract, and I wanted to clear my head before I went in. As I drove back home to grab some paperwork, my phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. Don't wait up for me tonight. I have another event. I didn't respond. I didn't even care at this point. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked out front. A shiny black SUV with tinted windows. My stomach sank. I walked up to the house, my heart pounding with every step. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't like Melissa at all. Inside, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. Melissa's and another man's. I crept closer, peeking around the corner. It was him, Richard. He was sitting at the table, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. Melissa was standing by the counter, pouring him a glass of wine. They were laughing about something, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My whole body was frozen in shock and rage. Then, as if sensing my presence, Richard turned his head and saw me. He didn't flinch, didn't seem surprised. He just gave me this smug little smile, the kind that made my blood boil. Oh, hey, he said casually, like this was all perfectly normal. Melissa told me you might stop by. Melissa turned around, her face pale. It's not what it looks like, she stammered. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, staring at the two of them, my hands trembling with barely contained fury. In that moment, I realized the life I thought I had was already gone. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The tension in the room was thick, and my pulse was pounding in my ears. Melissa stood frozen by the counter, her face pale, while Richard remained perfectly calm, still leaning back in the chair as if he belonged there. That smug grin of his was the final straw. What the hell is going on here? I finally managed to say, my voice low but sharp. Melissa opened her mouth, but no words came out. Richard, on the other hand, didn't seem the least bit bothered. He straightened up, pushing his chair back slowly. Relax, man. It's not what you think, he said, holding up his hands as if to calm me down. His tone was smooth, almost condescending, like he was trying to defuse a situation he found amusing. I took a step closer, my fists clenched. Then explain it to me, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been coming into my house while I'm out busting my ass for this family. Melissa finally found her voice. It's not like that, she said quickly. We just stopped here on the way to a meeting. I needed to change my clothes. Change your clothes, I repeated, my voice rising. And you couldn't do that at home before you left? You had to bring him here. She avoided my eyes, looking down at the counter instead. That told me everything I needed to know. I turned my attention back to Richard, who was now standing, his towering frame making the room feel smaller. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something cold and calculating, that made my skin crawl. You should leave, I said, my voice firm despite the anger threatening to boil over. Now. Richard looked at Melissa, then back at me. For a moment, I thought he was going to argue, but instead, he smirked. All right, I can take a hint, he said, grabbing his coat from the back of the chair. Melissa, I'll see you later. With that, he walked out, brushing past me on his way to the door. I stood there, my entire body tense, until I heard the sound of his SUV pulling out of the driveway. Then I turned back to Melissa, who still hadn't moved from her spot by the counter. "What's going on, Melissa?" I asked, my voice quieter now but no less demanding. "What is he doing here? And don't give me some excuse about meetings or changing clothes. I'm not stupid," she sighed, finally meeting my gaze. "You're overreacting," she said, her tone defensive. "Richard's my boss and he's helping me with work. That's all." "Helping you," I repeated, shaking my head. "I've seen the way he looks at you, Melissa, and I saw the way you looked at him just now. Do you think I'm blind?" "It's not like that," she insisted, but there was a crack in her voice now, and I could tell she was lying. "I found the money," I said suddenly, my voice cutting through the room like a knife. Her eyes widened, and I saw a flash of panic cross her face. "What money?" "The box in the attic," I said. "The one stuffed with cash. Do you want to explain where that came from? Because I've been working 2 jobs to keep this family afloat. And now I find out there's a small fortune hidden in my own house." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, struggling to come up with an answer. Finally, she said, "It's from my job." "It's bullshit," I interrupted, my anger boiling over. "No one makes that kind of money selling supplements. What are you really doing, Melissa?" Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I thought she might actually come clean. But instead, she shook her head. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," I said, my voice hard, "because right now, I'm wondering if you're even the person I thought you were." She didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her purse and walked toward the door. "I can't deal with this right now," she said. "I have a meeting." "You walk out that door, and we're done," I said, my voice trembling with rage and hurt. She stopped, her hand on the doorknob, but she didn't turn around. After a long pause, she said, "Maybe that's for the best." Then she walked out, leaving me standing there in the empty kitchen. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind. Richard in my house, the look on Melissa's face, the box of cash in the attic. None of it made sense, and yet it all felt painfully clear. She was lying to me, about everything. I wanted to confront her again, to demand answers, but she didn't come home that night, or the next. I tried calling her, but she didn't pick up. She sent a single text, "I need some time to think. Don't call me." I didn't know what to do. I felt like my whole world was falling apart, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The kids were asking where their mom was, and I didn't have an answer for them. I tried to keep things as normal as possible, but it was hard when all I could think about was how everything had gone so wrong. A few days later, I got a call from the electronics store manager. He wanted to finalize the contract, which should have been good news, but all I could feel was numb. I went through the motions, signing the paperwork and making plans to start the following week, but my heart wasn't in it. On my way home, I stopped by my mom's house to pick up the kids. She pulled me aside before I left, her face full of concern. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "The kids are worried about Melissa." "I don't know, Mom," I admitted, my voice cracking. "I really don't know." She gave me a long, hard look, then pulled me into a hug. "Whatever's going on, you'll get through it. You're stronger than you think." I wanted to believe her, but as I drove home with the kids in the back seat, their laughter and chatter filling the car, all I could think about was how much I was failing them. I couldn't even hold my family together. When we got home, I noticed something strange. The attic door was slightly ajar. My stomach sank as I climbed up the stairs, my hands shaking. The box of cash was gone. And just like that, the fragile hope I'd been clinging to shattered into a million pieces. The box of cash was gone. It was like the final piece of normalcy I'd been holding on to had been ripped away. My mind raced. Had Melissa taken it? If so, where had she gone and what was she planning? Or was it someone else? Had Richard been here again? My stomach churned at the thought of him sneaking into my house, taking something so significant without me knowing. I sat in the attic, staring at the empty space where the box had been. My hands were shaking, and I felt utterly helpless. I needed answers, but Melissa wasn't responding to my calls or texts. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, The anger started to boil over. I wasn't even sure who I was angrier at, her for abandoning us or myself for letting things get this bad. The next morning, Melissa finally broke her silence. She texted me, but the message was as cold as ice. I'm tired of all the fighting. I need time to figure things out. If you want to file for divorce, do it. I won't fight you. I sat there staring at my phone, rereading the message over and over. Divorce. The word hit me like a sledgehammer. I hadn't wanted to believe we were at that point, but maybe we were. What was left of our marriage? Anyway, just arguments, suspicion, and a growing distance that felt impossible to bridge. But what about the kids? They'd already been through so much. How was I supposed to explain this to them? Danny, my oldest, was already angry at his mom for how absent she'd been. Lily, my youngest, still asked for her every night before bed. And Ethan and Sam, they were too quiet, trying to act like everything was fine when I knew it wasn't. They deserved better than this chaos, and I didn't know if I could give it to them on my own. A week passed, and Melissa didn't come home. She hadn't even called to check on the kids. My mom came over a lot during that time, helping out with meals and school runs. I could see the worry in her eyes, but she didn't push me to talk. I think she knew I wasn't ready. One afternoon, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. If Melissa wasn't going to give me answers, I'd find them myself. I thought about hiring a private investigator, someone who could track her down and tell me what she'd been doing with all that money, and with Richard. But before I could even look into it, the police showed up at my door. It was the middle of the day, and I was at home working on some invoices for my phone repair shop. The knock on the door startled me, and when I opened it, 2 officers were standing there, serious expressions on their faces. "Mr. Daniels?" one of them asked. "Yes," I said cautiously. "Is something wrong?" "We need to talk to you about your wife, Melissa Daniels." My heart sank. For a split second, I thought the worst. Had she been in an accident? Was she hurt? Dead? But what they told me was somehow worse in a completely different way. Melissa had been arrested. They explained that the company she worked for, the one selling supplements, was a front for something much darker. The supplements were laced with illegal substances, and the entire operation was tied to a larger drug ring. Melissa had been working there for months, and they believed she knew exactly what she was involved in. The big boss, the one running the show, was none other than Richard. Richard, of course, had vanished. The police suspected he'd fled the country, leaving everyone else to take the fall. That included Melissa. I couldn't process what they were saying. My wife, my Melissa, was in jail for drug trafficking? It didn't seem real. They asked if they could search the house, and I agreed, too stunned to argue. Part of me hoped they wouldn't find anything, that this was all some kind of mistake. But then they found the box of cash. It wasn't in the attic anymore. It was hidden in our closet. I had no idea how it had ended up there. Melissa must have come back to the house at some point when I wasn't home. The officers counted the money and confiscated it, saying it would be used as evidence. I didn't even try to argue. What could I say? It was tainted money, and I didn't want it in my house anyway. After they left, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space where the box had been. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing. Melissa was in jail. The money was gone. And my kids, our kids, were upstairs, completely unaware of how much their world was about to change. That night, after the kids were asleep, I finally let myself break down. I sat in the living room, my head in my hands, tears streaming down my face. I wasn't just crying for myself. I was crying for them. For Danny, who needed stability as he entered his teenage years. For Ethan and Sam, who were too young to understand why their mom wasn't around. And for Lily, who still asked me every night, "When's mommy coming home?" I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't have an answer for anything. Over the next few days, I tried to piece together what little I could. Melissa was allowed one phone call, and she used it to call me. Her voice on the other end of the line was shaky, a mix of anger and regret. "They're saying I did things I didn't do," she said, her words rushing out. "I didn't know about the drugs, I swear. I just thought it was supplements. Richard handled all the business stuff. I was just a sales rep." "Melissa," I said, cutting her off. They found 100 grand in cash. That's not just sales rep money. She went quiet for a moment. Then, in a small voice, she said, I was trying to save it for us. For the kids. I wanted to get us out of this life, out of this constant struggle. By working for a drug dealer? I shot back, my anger rising again. Do you even understand what you've done to this family? Do you realize what this is doing to the kids? I didn't mean for it to go this far, she whispered, and I could hear the tears in her voice. I was stupid, okay? I thought I was helping, but I was stupid. Her regret sounded genuine, but it didn't make anything easier. I hung up the phone feeling more lost than ever. The weeks that followed were a blur of court hearings, lawyers, and endless questions from the kids. Melissa ended up getting a 5-year sentence, which was actually lenient compared to what the prosecutors had originally pushed for. The fact that Richard had disappeared, leaving her and the others to take the blame, worked in her favor, at least a little. But no sentence, no lawyer, no apology could undo the damage that had been done. My family was broken, and I wasn't sure if I could ever put it back together. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment when the police came to my door. Felt like a scene from someone else's life, not mine. Melissa, the woman I had built my world around, was now sitting in a jail cell. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more surreal it all felt. How had it come to this? How had the woman I'd loved for so many years gotten tangled up with someone like Richard and something so dangerous? The next few weeks were some of the hardest of my life. Every day felt like I was walking through quicksand, trying to keep my head above water while everything around me sank deeper. The kids were confused and scared, and I didn't know how to explain what was happening without completely shattering their sense of security. A few days after Melissa's arrest, I had my first meeting with her lawyer. He was a clean-cut guy in his 40s, with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that made it clear he'd seen it all before. As he walked me through the charges against Melissa, the full weight of her situation started to sink in. Your wife is facing serious allegations, he said, his tone calm but firm. The prosecutors believe she was knowingly involved in the distribution of controlled substances. The fact that large sums of cash were found in your home doesn't help her case. But she said she didn't know, I replied, clinging to the hope that there was some way out of this. She told me she thought it was just supplements. The lawyer gave me a look that was equal parts sympathetic and skeptical. Intent is difficult to prove, but the amount of money involved makes it hard to argue ignorance. The prosecution's stance is that she knew exactly what she was doing. I sat there in his office, feeling like the walls were closing in on me. I thought about the box of cash, about Richard, about the nights Melissa didn't come home. Deep down, I knew the lawyer was right. Maybe she hadn't started out with bad intentions, but at some point, she must have realized what she was caught up in, and she chose to keep going. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The best-case scenario is we negotiate a plea deal, he said. If she cooperates and provides information about the operation, the judge might be lenient. But given the circumstances, she's likely looking at several years behind bars. Several years. The words echoed in my head as I drove home that day. I tried to imagine telling the kids their mom wasn't coming back for a long time, and the thought was unbearable. Danny would understand, of course. He was old enough to know that something was seriously wrong. But how would I explain it to Lily? How could I look into her big, innocent eyes and tell her that her mom wasn't coming home? Melissa called me a few days later. It was the first time we'd spoken since her arrest, and hearing her voice on the other end of the line was almost more than I could handle. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. I know I've made a mess of everything. I didn't mean for this to happen. Didn't mean for it to happen? I said, my anger bubbling to the surface. Melissa, you've been lying to me for months. You've been working with a drug dealer. You've put this entire family in danger, and now you're in jail. How do you not mean for that to happen? She started crying, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I thought about the kids, the way Danny had been shutting down, the way Lily still asked for her mom every night, and my anger came rushing back. You don't understand, she said through her tears. I was trying to make things better for us. I was trying to get us out of this constant struggle. At what cost? I snapped. You've destroyed our family, Melissa. The kids don't even know what's going on. How am I supposed to explain this to them? She didn't have an answer, and neither did I. The call ended shortly after that, leaving me feeling even more lost than before. The days blurred into weeks as Melissa's court hearings dragged on. I did my best to shield the kids from the worst of it, but it wasn't easy. Danny started skipping basketball practice, saying he didn't see the point anymore. Ethan and Sam were quieter than ever, and Lily became clingy, refusing to let me out of her sight. One afternoon, while I was helping Lily with her homework, she looked up at me with those big, trusting eyes and asked, "Daddy, why doesn't Mommy come home anymore? Did I do something bad?" My heart broke right there at the kitchen table. I wanted to tell her the truth, but how could I? How do you explain to a 6-year-old that her mom is in jail? Instead, I pulled her into my lap and hugged her tight. "It's not your fault, sweetheart," I said, my voice shaky. "Mommy just has some things she needs to take care of right now. But I promise I'll always be here for you. Okay?" She nodded, resting her head against my chest, and I fought back the tears threatening to spill over. Melissa's sentencing came faster than I expected. The lawyer managed to negotiate a plea deal, which reduced her sentence to 5 years. It was the best outcome we could have hoped for, but it didn't feel like a victory. 5 years is a long time, especially when you're trying to hold a family together on your own. The day of her sentencing, I didn't bring the kids to court. I couldn't bear the thought of them seeing their mom in handcuffs, sitting in a courtroom as the judge handed down her punishment. I sat there alone, listening as the lawyers argued back and forth, feeling like I was in some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. When it was over, Melissa turned to look at me as they led her away. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw the regret written all over her face. But I couldn't bring myself to nod or wave or do anything to acknowledge her. I just sat there, frozen, as she disappeared from view. That night, after putting the kids to bed, I sat in the living room with a bottle of whiskey, staring at the family photo hanging on the wall. It was taken 2 years ago, back when things were still good. Melissa was smiling, holding Lily in her arms, while Danny and the twins stood on either side of me. We looked happy. We were happy. Now, that picture felt like a cruel reminder of everything we'd lost. As the hours ticked by, I realized I couldn't stay in this house. The memories were too heavy, the walls too full of ghosts. If I was going to give my kids any chance at a normal life, I needed to leave all of this behind. It was time to start over, no matter how impossible it seemed. I didn't know how or where, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end. I wasn't going to let it be. The days after Melissa's sentencing were the hardest. I had been hanging on to some sliver of hope that things would somehow turn around, that maybe this nightmare would end with her coming home. But now there was no denying it. Melissa was gone, and it was just me and the kids. Telling them was the most difficult thing I've ever had to do. I gathered all 4 of them in the living room one evening, knowing I couldn't put it off any longer. Danny sat with his arms crossed, already looking like he didn't want to hear what I had to say. Ethan and Sam sat quietly on the couch, their faces nervous, and Lily clung to my leg, looking up at me with those big, innocent eyes. "Where's Mommy?" she asked for the 100th time, her little voice breaking my heart all over again. I took a deep breath, kneeling down so I was eye level with her. "Sweetheart," I said gently, "Mommy's not going to be coming home for a while." Her eyes widened. "Why not?" She made some mistakes," I said carefully, trying to find the right words. "And now she has to spend some time away to make things right." Danny let out a bitter laugh from the couch. "Mistakes? You mean she got arrested, right? She's in jail. Just say it." "Danny," I said sharply, but he was already on his feet, pacing back and forth. "You think we don't know what's going on?" he snapped, his voice trembling with anger. "We hear people talking about it at school. Everyone knows, Dad. Everyone. They're calling her a criminal. They're calling us criminals." I didn't know what to say. He wasn't wrong. Word had gotten around fast. Our neighbors, the other kids at school, even some of the parents I used to talk to at basketball games, they all knew. And the way they looked at us now, the whispers and the stares, made it clear they had already passed judgment. "I'm sorry, Danny," I said quietly. "I know this is hard, but whatever," he muttered, cutting me off. "I don't even care anymore." He stormed upstairs, slamming his bedroom door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, and I felt like the worst father in the world. Ethan and Sam exchanged a nervous glance but didn't say anything. Lily, still too young to fully understand, just looked up at me and said, "Is Mommy mad at us?" I hugged her tightly, fighting back tears. "No, sweetheart. Mommy loves you so much. Don't ever forget that. Okay?" The weeks that followed were a blur of survival. I threw myself into work, trying to keep the phone repair shop running while also taking as many taxi shifts as I could. Money was tight. Tighter than ever, especially with the police confiscating the cash Melissa had stashed away. My mom helped out when she could, watching the kids when I was working late, but I could tell it was wearing on her too. Danny's anger didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. He started skipping school, coming home late, and snapping at his siblings over the smallest things. I tried to talk to him, but he would just shut me down. "You're not fixing anything, Dad," he said one night during yet another argument. "You're just pretending everything's fine, but it's not." He wasn't wrong. I was pretending. Every day, I plastered on a brave face for the kids, telling them we'd get through this, that everything would be okay. But deep down, I wasn't sure if I believed it. I felt like I was drowning, and there was no one to pull me out. One night, about a month after Melissa's sentencing, my best friend Mark came over. Mark had been my closest friend since high school, and he was one of the few people who hadn't abandoned me when everything went down. He brought a 6-pack of beer and a box of pizza, sitting down across from me at the kitchen table. "You look like hell," he said, cracking open a beer and sliding it across to me. "Thanks," I muttered, taking a sip. "That's exactly what I needed to hear. I'm serious, man. You can't keep running yourself into the ground like this. You've got 4 kids who need you. You think I don't know that?" I snapped, the frustration spilling out before I could stop it. Every day, I'm trying to keep things together, and it feels like it's never enough. The kids are falling apart, I'm barely scraping by, and I don't even know how we're supposed to move forward from this. Mark didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, letting me vent, which was more than I could say for most people. Finally, he said, "You need a plan." I laughed bitterly. "A plan? For what? My wife's in prison. My oldest son hates me, and everyone in this damn town thinks we're criminals. What kind of plan do you suggest for that?" "You need to get out of here," he said simply. "Start fresh. This place is toxic, and it's not doing you or the kids any good. Take them somewhere new, somewhere you can build a better life." I wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't that simple. But deep down, I knew he was right. Every time I walked into town, I felt the weight of the stares and the whispers. Every time the kids went to school, they came home a little more broken. This place wasn't home anymore. It was a prison of its own. That night, after Mark left, I sat in the living room, staring at the wall for what felt like hours. Could I really just leave? Could I uproot the kids and move to a place where no one knew us, where we could start over? The idea terrified me, but the alternative, staying here, in the shadow of everything that had happened, felt even worse. I made my decision the next morning. Over breakfast, I told the kids we were moving. Danny scoffed, saying it wouldn't change anything. But Ethan and Sam looked hopeful for the first time in weeks. Lily, still too young to fully grasp what was happening, just asked if we could bring her stuffed animals. I smiled at her and said, "Of course we can, sweetheart. We'll bring everything important." As I started packing up our lives, I felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months. Maybe this was what we needed. Maybe we could leave the past behind and build something better. I didn't know where the road would take us, but I knew one thing for sure. We had to keep moving forward. Packing up our lives wasn't easy. Every box I filled felt like I was burying a part of the past, and the deeper I went, the more memories I uncovered. Photos of Melissa and me from before the chaos started, the kids' school art projects, even little things like her favorite coffee mug. It all reminded me of a time when life was simpler, when we were happy. But I knew I couldn't dwell on it. We needed to leave. Staying in this town would only keep the wounds fresh. I managed to find a small house to rent in a city about 2 hours away. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was far enough from this place that we could start fresh. I didn't tell many people we were leaving, just Mark and my mom. I didn't even leave a forwarding address. It felt safer that way, as if cutting ties completely would somehow help us heal. The night before we were set to move, I stayed up late, double-checking everything. The kids were already asleep, and the house was eerily quiet. I sat on the couch, nursing a beer, staring at the half-empty living room. It felt surreal, leaving behind everything I'd built here. The memories, the struggles, even the heartbreak. I was lost in thought when I heard it. The sound of the front door creaking open. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was supposed to be locked. I had locked it myself. Slowly, I reached under the couch, where I kept a hammer. A habit I'd picked up after Melissa's arrest. I gripped it tightly, every muscle in my body tense as I listened. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a thief? A neighbor? Or worse, someone connected to Melissa's past? The thought of Richard sent a chill down my spine. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steady despite the fear gripping me. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a deep, calm voice answered from the darkness. "Relax, man. It's me." He stepped into the dim light of the living room, and my stomach dropped. It was Richard. He was even more intimidating up close. Broad shoulders, a thick neck, and a face that seemed carved from stone. He was wearing a black leather jacket, his hair slicked back, and he carried a sports bag slung over one shoulder. His presence filled the room, making it feel smaller, suffocating. "What do you want?" I asked, gripping the hammer so tightly my knuckles turned white. He raised his hands in mock surrender, a smirk playing on his lips. "Relax. I'm not here to hurt you." "Then why are you in my house?" He took a step closer, setting the bag down on the floor with a heavy thud. "I came to talk. That's all." I didn't lower the hammer. "Talk about what?" "Melissa," he said simply, "and the mess she's in." My chest tightened at the sound of her name. "She's in prison because of you." Richard shrugged, as if it didn't matter. "She made her choices. I didn't force her to do anything. But I didn't want this for her either." "Bullshit," I spat. "You used her. You dragged her into your mess and left her to take the fall." His expression darkened, the smirk vanishing. "Careful," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know the whole story. Then why don't you enlighten me?" I shot back, my anger outweighing my fear. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I didn't come here to argue. I came here to apologize. For what it's worth, I didn't want her to end up in prison. I cared about her." "Cared about her?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You destroyed her life. You destroyed our family." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he crouched down and unzipped the sports bag. My grip on the hammer tightened, my heart racing as I imagined what he might pull out. A gun? Drugs? Something worse? But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was stacks of cash. 300 grand, he said, standing up and looking me in the eye. "It's clean. No strings attached." I stared at the money, my mind reeling. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It's for you," he said. "For Melissa. For the kids. I know I can't fix what happened, but maybe this can help you start over." I didn't know what to say. My instincts told me to throw him out, to tell him to take his blood money and leave. But another part of me, the part that had been struggling to provide for my family, couldn't ignore what that kind of money could do for us. It could pay off debts, cover rent, give the kids a better life. Could give us a real chance at starting over. "I don't want your money," I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. Richard nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Fair enough, he said, picking up the bag and walking toward the door. But just before he left, he stopped and turned back to me. For what it's worth, he said quietly, Melissa always talked about how much she wanted a better life for the kids. She wasn't just doing this for herself. Remember that. With that, he walked out the door, leaving the bag of money on the floor. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the bag. My thoughts were a jumbled mess. Anger, confusion, guilt, and, above all, fear. This money could change everything. But it could also come with risks I couldn't see yet. As I stood there, lost in thought, Danny appeared in the hallway, rubbing his eyes. "Dad?" he asked sleepily. "Who was that?" "No one," I said quickly, walking over to him and steering him back toward his room. "Go back to bed." After I tucked him in, I returned to the living room and sat on the couch, staring at the bag. I knew I should call the police, report what had happened. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. Instead, I opened the bag and started counting. $300,000, just like Richard said. Enough to give us a new start. Enough to keep us afloat while I figured out what to do next. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. It was fleeting and fragile, but it was there. I didn't know if taking the money was the right choice, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let my family fall apart any further. Not if I could help it. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I had a boulder sitting on my chest. The sports bag full of cash was still sitting on the living room floor, right where I'd left it. Every time I looked at it, I felt a mix of relief and unease. $300,000 was more money than I had ever seen in my life. But it wasn't just money. It was a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Everything that had fallen apart. I spent most of the day going through the motions, trying to focus on the move. The kids didn't know about the money, of course, and I wasn't planning on telling them. As far as they were concerned, we were leaving to get a fresh start, and that was the truth, at least partially. But deep down, I knew this money was the only reason we could afford that fresh start. That evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with the bag in front of me. I started making a list of everything we'd need. The deposit for the new house, moving expenses, school supplies, and enough to keep us afloat until I could get my new business up and running. I didn't want to blow through the money recklessly. I wanted to be smart about it to make it last. But there was a nagging voice in the back of my mind, telling me I was making a mistake. This money wasn't mine. It was tied to Richard, to Melissa, to everything I'd been trying to leave behind. If anyone found out where it came from, it could destroy everything we were trying to rebuild. Still, what choice did I have? I couldn't turn it down. Not when the kids were depending on me. We left the next morning. I packed the kids and whatever belongings we could fit into my beat-up sedan, leaving behind everything else. The house looked so empty as we pulled out of the driveway, but I felt no sadness. If anything, I felt relief. This place wasn't home anymore. It was just a shell of the life we'd lost. It was time to leave it behind. The drive to the new city was quiet. Danny had his headphones on, staring out the window with a scowl. Ethan and Sam dozed off in the back seat, and Lily hummed softly to herself, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. I glanced at them in the rearview mirror, feeling a surge of determination. This move wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about giving them a future. The new house was small but cozy, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood where no one knew us. The landlord didn't ask too many questions, and I paid the deposit in cash, using some of the money from Richard's bag. It felt strange handing over those crisp bills, knowing where they'd come from. But I pushed the thought aside. We were here now, and that was all that mattered. The kids adjusted to the new place quicker than I expected. Ethan and Sam seemed excited about their new school, and Lily loved the little park down the street. Even Danny, who had been so angry and withdrawn, started coming out of his shell. He joined the basketball team at his new school, and I caught him smiling for the first time in months. I threw myself into starting over, too. I found a small storefront to rent for my phone repair business and used some of the cash to buy new tools and supplies. It wasn't easy. Building a business from scratch never is. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just surviving. One night, about a month after the move, I sat on the back porch, sipping a beer and looking up at the stars. The kids were asleep, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the house was peaceful. But my mind was anything but calm. I couldn't stop thinking about Melissa. I hadn't spoken to her since the move, and I hadn't told her where we'd gone. Part of me wanted to keep it that way, to cut her out of our lives completely. But another part of me, one I didn't want to admit existed, missed her. Despite everything she'd done, despite all the lies and the pain, I still loved her. Or at least I loved the version of her I used to know. I wondered what she was doing, how she was holding up in prison. Was she thinking about us? About the kids? Did she regret what she'd done? Or was she still blaming me for everything that had gone wrong? I didn't have answers to any of those questions, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. The next day, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Melissa. Hearing her voice after all this time was like a punch to the gut. She sounded different, softer, almost fragile. "I heard you moved," she said quietly. "Where are you?" "We're somewhere safe," I replied, keeping my tone even. "That's all you need to know." She was silent for a moment, and I could hear the faint hum of background noise on her end. "How are the kids?" she asked finally. "They're doing fine," I said, though it wasn't entirely true. They were adjusting, sure, but they still missed her. Lily asked about her constantly, and even Danny, despite his anger, had started leaving little drawings of her on his desk. "I'm glad," she said, her voice trembling. "I miss them." There was a long pause, and I debated whether to say what was on my mind. Finally, I decided to ask, "Why, Melissa? Why did you do it?" She sighed heavily. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought I was helping. I thought I was doing something good for us, for the kids. But I got in too deep, and by the time I realized it, it was too late." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. I wanted to believe her, but part of me still couldn't shake the anger. "You didn't just hurt yourself, Melissa. You hurt all of us." "I know," she whispered. "And I'm so sorry. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you. To them." I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I told her the kids were fine, and we ended the call. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time since Melissa's arrest, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before: hope. Maybe it was foolish, but part of me wanted to believe she could change, that we could rebuild somehow. But for now, all I could do was focus on the present, on my kids, my work, and the new life we were trying to create. The past wasn't going to disappear, but at least now it felt a little further away. A year passed faster than I expected. Life in the new city wasn't easy, but it was steady. The kids were thriving in their new schools, and the cloud of gossip and shame from our old town had finally lifted. Danny started to smile again. Ethan and Sam made friends quickly, and Lily seemed happier than I'd seen her in months. She still missed her mom, though. Every so often, I'd catch her sitting by the window, staring out like she was waiting for Melissa to walk through the door. The phone repair shop was doing well, better than I had hoped. With fewer distractions, I was able to focus on growing the business. I hired an assistant, expanded our services, and even started saving money again, this time legitimate money. I still hadn't touched most of the cash Richard left behind. I kept it locked away in a safe, using it sparingly for emergencies. I didn't like that it was there, but I couldn't deny how much it had helped us start over. But even as life improved, there was always a shadow hanging over us. Melissa. The day of her release came sooner than I expected. Lawyers, as they say, work miracles when paid well, and Melissa's sentence had been reduced to just over a year. I hadn't told the kids she was getting out. They didn't even know I'd been in touch with her. She called me occasionally from prison, and while those conversations were never easy, they were necessary. She told me about her plans, how she'd changed, how she wanted to make things right. I wanted to believe her, but I still had doubts. People don't change overnight, and Melissa had a lot to prove. When I went to pick her up from the prison, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked thinner, her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. She wasn't wearing makeup, and her eyes had a tired, almost haunted look. She spotted me before I saw her, and when our eyes met, she smiled. A small, hesitant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi," she said as she climbed into the passenger seat of my car. "Hi," I replied, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with all the things we weren't saying. "Thank you for coming," she said finally, her voice soft. "I wasn't sure if you would." I glanced at her, my expression unreadable. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for the kids." Her smile faltered, and she nodded. "I understand." The drive back to the house was quiet. She asked a few questions about the kids, how they were doing, what they were up to, but I kept my answers short. I wasn't ready to let her back in, not yet. She needed to earn that. When we got home, the kids were waiting. I had told them that morning that their mom was coming back, and their reactions had been mixed. Lily was ecstatic, practically bouncing with excitement. Ethan and Sam were cautious but curious. Danny, on the other hand, had stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him. When Melissa walked through the door, Lily ran to her, throwing her arms around her waist. "Mommy!" she cried, burying her face in Melissa's shirt. Melissa dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she hugged her tightly. "Oh, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I missed you so much." Ethan and Sam hung back, watching uncertainly. Melissa smiled at them, wiping her tears. "Hi, boys," she said gently. "I missed you too." They hesitated for a moment before walking over to her, letting her pull them into a hug. I stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold. Part of me wanted to join in, to let myself feel the relief and joy they were feeling. But another part of me, one that was still raw and angry, held back. Danny didn't come downstairs until dinner. When he finally did, he barely looked at Melissa. He sat at the table, stabbing at his food with his fork, his jaw tight. The tension was palpable, but Melissa didn't push him. She tried to make small talk, asking him about school and basketball, but he gave her one-word answers or ignored her completely. "Danny," I said finally, my voice firm, "at least try to be civil." He dropped his fork, glaring at me. "Why? She wasn't here for any of it. She left us." "That's enough," I said, my tone sharp. Melissa held up a hand, stopping me. "It's okay," she said quietly, turning to Danny. "You're right. I wasn't here, and I'm so sorry for that." Danny scoffed, crossing his arms. "Sorry doesn't fix anything." "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'm going to try. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you." He didn't respond. Instead, he stood up and walked out of the room, leaving his plate untouched. The next few weeks were awkward, to say the least. Melissa did her best to reintegrate into our lives, but it was clear she was struggling. She was quiet, almost hesitant, as if she didn't know where she fit anymore. She spent most of her time with the kids, trying to rebuild her relationship with them. Lily forgave her almost instantly, clinging to her like she was afraid she might disappear again. Ethan and Sam warmed up to her slowly, though they were still cautious. Danny, however, was a different story. He avoided her as much as possible, refusing to engage with her beyond basic pleasantries. One night, I found him in the garage, sitting on an old bench with his head in his hands. "Hey," I said, sitting down next to him. "What's going on?" He didn't look at me. "I don't know how to forgive her," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to, but I can't." I put a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to forgive her right away," I said. "It's okay to feel the way you feel. Just give it time." Melissa, to her credit, didn't give up. She started going to therapy, working on herself and her mistakes. She also got a job at a local diner, something small and manageable that allowed her to contribute without overwhelming herself. She was different now, quieter, humbler, and more focused on the kids than ever before. Slowly, I started to see glimpses of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. One evening, As we sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed, she turned to me and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me, on us." I didn't respond right away. I was still angry, still hurt, but I could see how hard she was trying. "We're not there yet," I said finally, "but I'm willing to try." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like we had a chance. The months that followed Melissa's return were filled with ups and downs. It was like walking a tightrope, balancing between hope and resentment. She was trying, there was no doubt about that. Therapy became a regular part of her life, and she never missed a session. She apologized to the kids often, sometimes through tears, and worked hard to rebuild their trust, even when it seemed like an impossible task. Danny was still the hardest to reach. He barely acknowledged her, and when he did, it was with a coldness that hurt her deeply. I could see it in her eyes every time he brushed her off, but she never let it deter her. She kept showing up for him, offering to drive him to practice, cheering him on at games, and leaving his favorite snacks on the counter. He didn't respond at first, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, his walls began to crack. One night, I came home late from the shop to find Danny and Melissa sitting at the kitchen table. She was helping him with his math homework, something he usually refused to let her do. They weren't talking much, but the fact that he hadn't walked away spoke volumes. I leaned against the doorway, watching them in silence, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd be okay. Meanwhile, Melissa and I were finding our own way back to each other. It wasn't easy. There were days when I couldn't look at her without feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The lies, the betrayal, the years of pain. But then there were moments when I saw the woman I had fallen in love with. The way she laughed with Lily, the quiet determination in her eyes when she was trying to make things right. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, we sat on the couch, sipping coffee and talking about nothing in particular. It was the first time in years that it felt normal, comfortable, like we weren't two people trying to pick up the pieces of a broken marriage, but just a husband and wife enjoying each other's company. "I missed this," she said quietly, staring down at her coffee mug. "Yeah," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty in my voice. "Me too." Despite the progress we were making as a family, there were still reminders of the past that we couldn't escape. Melissa's time in prison wasn't exactly a secret, and while the new neighborhood had been kind to us so far, there were still whispers. At school, the kids overheard other parents talking about us. Lily came home in tears one day after a girl in her class said something cruel about Melissa. I wanted to march straight to the school and demand answers, but Melissa stopped me. "Let it go," she said. "We can't control what people think. All we can do is show them we're not who they think we are." She was right, of course, but it didn't make it any easier. The real turning point came about 6 months after Melissa's release. We were sitting at the dinner table when Danny finally spoke up. "I think I want to join therapy," he said, almost too quietly to hear. Melissa looked up from her plate, her eyes wide with surprise. That's a great idea," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think it could really help." He nodded but didn't say anything else. After dinner, I pulled him aside and asked if he wanted to talk. "I'm still angry," he admitted, his voice shaky. "But I don't want to feel like this forever." Hearing that broke my heart and gave me hope all at once. He was trying just like the rest of us. We were all trying. Melissa's efforts extended beyond just the family. She started volunteering at a local rehab center, working with people who were struggling with addiction. At first, I thought it was just something she was doing to keep herself busy. But the more I saw her in action, the more I realized it was her way of making amends. Not just to us, but to the world. She knew she couldn't erase her past, but she was determined to do something good moving forward. One evening, as we sat on the porch after dinner, she told me about a young woman she'd been mentoring at the rehab center. "She reminds me of me," Melissa said, her voice soft. "She got caught up in something she didn't fully understand, and now she's trying to fix it. I see her and I think, if she can turn her life around, maybe I can too." "You already are," I said without thinking. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine, and for the first time, I realized I truly believed it. With time, the wounds began to heal. Danny warmed up to Melissa bit by bit, and their relationship started to rebuild, brick by fragile brick. Ethan and Sam became more relaxed around her, and Lily, sweet, forgiving Lily, was her shadow, following her everywhere she went. Our family wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but we were together, and that was something. One day, Melissa came to me with an idea. "What if we did something meaningful with the money?" she asked. I didn't need to ask what money she was talking about. The $300,000 from Richard was still sitting in the safe, mostly untouched. I had kept it as a safety net, but the truth was, it had always felt like a weight around my neck. "What do you have in mind?" I asked. "A donation," she said, "to the rehab center. Or maybe to a fund that helps families affected by drugs. Something to make up for the damage we caused." I stared at her, surprised by the suggestion. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. That money had been a lifeline for us, but it wasn't ours to keep. It was tainted, a reminder of everything we'd been through. Giving it away felt like the right thing to do. A few weeks later, we made the donation anonymously. The rehab center was stunned, and Melissa seemed lighter, freer, as if a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. "That money didn't belong to us," she said that night as we sat in bed. "But now, maybe it can do some good." I reached over and took her hand. "You're doing good, Melissa. You're proving that people can change." She smiled at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you for not giving up on me." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The future still wasn't guaranteed, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were heading in the right direction. Together. Years passed and life moved on. It wasn't always easy, but little by little, the shadows of our past grew fainter. The kids grew up faster than I ever thought possible. Danny, the boy who once locked himself away in anger and hurt, graduated high school and went off to college on a basketball scholarship. Watching him walk across that stage, tall and confident, brought tears to my eyes. I thought about the nights I'd sat outside his room, wondering if he'd ever forgive us, wondering if we'd lost him forever. And yet, here he was, beaming at his family in the crowd. Ethan and Sam followed their own paths, finding their passions and thriving in ways that made me proud beyond words. And Lily, my little girl, grew into a woman right before my eyes. She was still my sunshine, always full of life and love, but she was also strong, stronger than I had ever been at her age. She had lived through so much, yet she carried herself with grace and resilience. The day Lily got engaged was when I finally let myself breathe. Her fiancé was a good man, kind and steady, the kind of person I always hoped she'd find. Watching her prepare for her wedding reminded me of everything we'd been through as a family and how far we'd come. Melissa had changed too. She wasn't the same person who had walked out of that prison years ago. She'd dedicated herself to helping others, pouring her energy into the rehab center, and becoming a mentor for people who were trying to rebuild their lives. She had rebuilt our family too, piece by piece, never giving up even when it felt like the damage was too great to repair. Our marriage wasn't perfect, no marriage ever is, but we learned to trust each other again, to communicate in ways we never had before. There were still moments of tension, times when old wounds flared up, but we faced them together. For better or worse, we had survived. On the morning of Lily's wedding, I sat in my living room, holding an old family photo. It was the one we'd taken years ago, before everything had fallen apart. I traced the faces with my thumb, Melissa smiling so brightly, Danny, still a boy back then, Ethan and Sam, standing on either side of me, and Lily, barely old enough to stand on her own. It was a picture of a simpler time, a time when I thought our lives were unshakable. Melissa walked in, dressed for the wedding, and sat down beside me. "I remember that day," she said softly, looking at the photo. "We had no idea what was coming." "No," I said. "We didn't." She reached for my hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'm sorry for all the pain I caused," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for what I did to you, to the kids, I squeezed her hand. I forgave you a long time ago, Melissa. We wouldn't be here if I hadn't. She looked at me, tears brimming in her eyes. I don't deserve you. It's not about deserving, I said. It's about love and forgiveness and the fact that we've built something stronger than what we had before. She nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. At the wedding, as I walked Lily down the aisle, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. Not just for her, but for all of us. We had been through hell and back, but we'd made it. We were stronger, closer, and more grateful for each other than ever before. After the ceremony, Melissa and I stood off to the side, watching the kids laugh and dance together. Danny had flown in from college, and even he was smiling as he twirled Lily around the dance floor. Ethan and Sam were teasing each other by the dessert table, and Lily looked radiant, glowing with happiness. For the first time in years, I felt like everything was exactly as it should be. Melissa leaned into me, resting her head on my shoulder. Do you ever wonder, she said, if we'd do anything differently if we could go back? I thought about it for a moment. I don't know, I said honestly. I wish we hadn't gone through so much pain, but if we hadn't, I don't think we'd be the people we are now. She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. You're right, it's made us stronger. Years later, I found myself sitting in a rocking chair on the porch, watching the sun set over our quiet neighborhood. The kids were all grown and scattered across the country, building lives of their own. Melissa was inside, working on a fundraising campaign for the rehab center. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good, honest, peaceful. I thought about everything we'd been through, the heartbreak, the betrayals, the long road to redemption. And I thought about the bag of money Richard had left behind, the money that had saved us and also haunted me for years. Giving it away had been one of the best decisions we ever made. It felt like closing a chapter, paying back a debt we owed to the universe. Looking back, I don't know if I'd change anything. Maybe I'd have fought harder, seen the warning signs earlier, done more to keep us from falling apart. But then again, maybe we needed to fall apart to rebuild something better. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that life isn't about avoiding the storms. It's about learning to dance in the rain, to rebuild after the winds have torn everything down. And we did that. We rebuilt. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I smiled to myself. Melissa stepped out onto the porch, holding 2 mugs of coffee, and handed one to me. What are you thinking about? She asked. I took a sip of the coffee, letting the warmth spread through me. Just everything, I said. How far we've come. She smiled, sitting down beside me. We've come a long way, and we had. Through the pain, the mistakes, and the trials, we'd found our way back to each other. We'd built a life worth living, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more dramatic and intriguing tales, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to me and helps bring more exciting content your way. Also, share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in this situation? See you in the next story.